I'm excited because a lot of you already know this, but we recently changed our name, and we had a signing ceremony, and we kind of did some celebration on March 25th, to correspond with Flannery's birthday. But we are now officially the Flannery O'Connor Institute for the Humanities. And that name change was largely to kind of distinguish um, the institute from Andalusia, the historic property. So that's so this is one of our first programs under our new name, which is exciting. Um, and with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our MC for tonight's programming. Somebody who's no stranger to the Flannery O'Connor Institute. That's Craig Martell. Um, Craig was a 2021. No, why did I say 21? 2023. It feels like it was that long ago. 2023 NEH Summer Fellow. Um, and he also runs the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee OSHA programming. And he's done it around a lot of programming around Flannery O'Connor, and he's been heavily involved in Flannery O'Connor studies. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Craig Martell.
Yes, thank you, Jordan. Much appreciate the introduction. I wanted to ask Tammy if she could put up a short PowerPoint slide deck I sent over earlier. There's a few things I want to point to as we get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone, in particular our two guest speakers, Amy Alznauer and Rosemary Magee. So one second here. Jordan, thank you for the branding. I recognized when I came back to my desk that I had missed that, so thank you very much. So next slide, please. So just to make sure everyone is on the right airplane this evening, this is Flannery O'Connor at the Crossroads. Our two guests speakers are Rosemary Magee and Amy Alznauer, who were two of the curators at the Emory exhibit at the Crossroads with Benny Andrews, Flannery O'Connor and Alice Walker, and they will share their passions and curiosities that drew them to this archival work and shaped their curation. They'll have many images from the archive and touch on some of Flannery's artifacts. So next slide, please. So just to reinforce a couple points on my bio, since the fall of 2019, we have done 9 5-part series on Flannery O'Connor at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UW Milwaukee. I see some of my O'Connor guest scholars on the session tonight. That kind of enabled me to get admitted to the Summer Institute. And one of my goals there was to extend my Flannery World Network to provide more depth on Flannery to that growing Osher community. And I think of it here in Milwaukee as a COVID super spreader event. But tonight's session is really a direct fruit of that NEH Institute. And just a very minor but important to me side note is that I'm in this secular order of Discalced Secular Carmelites. Here, there's a main community here at Holy Hill in Milwaukee. But as my interest in Flannery has evolved, I have an appreciation and respect, an understanding of what I call the mystical and contemplative dimensions of her life as she aged and approached her own death. So next slide, please. So I wanted to just light on the introductions of Rosemary and Amy. I met Rosemary through Amy in December, and she agreed to do this session, which we thought would be better served on the Andalusia, the Flannery O'Connor for the Humanities platform. So Rosemary has long roots in Flannery world. She served for 3 decades, wide-ranging roles at Emory. She was the director of the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library, where maybe 18 or so of us from the Institute spent some time with Flannery O'Connor's collection there at the Rose Library. She was involved in the collection of those papers, in addition to those of Harper Lee and our former president, Barack Obama, while expanding the African American and Irish literary collections. She's published a number of volumes, edited conversations with Flannery O'Connor, selected interviews very early on, and Friendship and Sympathy Communities of Southern Writers, along with a collection of short stories, Family Impromptu. Amy Alznauer's work has won the Annie Dillard Award for Creative Nonfiction and the Christopher Award. She's the author of a number of books that we have in our household: The Boy Who Dreamed of Infinity, The Strange Birds of Flannery O'Connor, which we have shared with many of our family friends. She's got a new book, a new picture book in the pipeline, The Five Sides of Marjorie Rice, forthcoming from Candlewick in 2025, and is working away on a middle grade novel. She teaches math and at Northwestern and lives in Evanston, but strongly encourage you to check out her website that's posted there. I just wanted to make a couple of personal comments. Amy, who we met in Savannah, was one of those O'Connor guest scholars on 2 occasions. She helped us with a Temple of the Holy Ghost and then one of the sections of The Violent Beard Away. So she's a well-known Flannery friend of our community in Milwaukee. And she also presented, as I mentioned, to a subset of NEH participants during our visit to the Rose Library during the June Institute. And our Osher circle of O'Connor fans is honored and humble that Rosemary has agreed to do a session with us in April on the 22nd at 3:15. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, to discuss her relationship with Sally Fitzgerald and a paper that she wrote about that friendship called The Habit of Friendship. Rosemary, when she agreed to do that session, actually volunteered herself and Amy to do tonight's session. So we thought it made more sense to be on this platform rather than Osher. So we're just delighted to have their presence and participation in tonight's session. But before I turn the mic and the hosting and PowerPoints over to that team, I want to advance the slide and just pause for a second. We wanted to just pause and shout out a thank you to Jordan Kofer, who in our discussion earlier, before we let in the majority of the participants, that Jordan will be leaving Georgia Collegiate State University, bound northward to Minnesota. But there's something I ran into in his acknowledgments in his book, The Gospel According to Flannery O'Connor, that in my opinion just captures the essence of what our 2 guest speakers mean to this series. Quoting Jordan's acknowledgement, along the way, I also received much more help and encouragement than I deserved from a large number of Flannery O'Connor scholars, the most kind-hearted and encouraging academic community out there. Fellow scholars did more than offer me direction. They took me seriously, took my idea seriously, and treated me a professional, as they encouragingly fanned the flame of my enthusiasm for Flannery O'Connor. That holds true to many of the people I've met throughout my Osher Institute curated series, the scholars I sat side by side with, and some of the presenters there at the Institute this summer, and certainly this evening. So with that, I wanted to turn the hosting over to our 2 guests, Rosemary and Amy. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Craig. I have a quick question. Is the little icon for the new Flannery O'Connor, I'm not getting the name right, but the change of name for Andalusia Institute to Flannery O'Connor, is that like a new logo that you came up with?
Yeah, we had a new logo design for it. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Again, that was that's to kind of separate, differentiate a little bit from from the historic property of Andalusia.
Right.
Well, Amy and I have been looking forward to this, and we're happy to be here this evening, and I'll proceed to share my screen and Sure hope I'm pulling up the right one.
I'll let you know if it's wrong.
And there we are.
Yeah.
Everybody can see me, can see the screen. Thank you so much for that introduction, Craig, and for this opportunity. Amy and I were co-curators for this really large-scale exhibition here at Emory University in our Woodruff Library. And it's both an honor, a privilege, and a challenge to do so. We're going to share with you some of our journey and some of what we discovered along the way and some of the materials included. It's called At the Crossroads, and it engages the lives and work of Benny Andrews, Alice Walker, and Flannery O'Connor. And of course, there was both the geographical crossroads and other kinds of crossroads that we'll delve into in both the exhibition and in this presentation. We thought we'd start with what is our curatorial statement that we put together with our other curators. You'll be introduced to them a little bit later, but there were 5 of us all together. So you can imagine that everything went perfectly and seamlessly at all times. With that said, we're all really pleased with the results. So as we engaged with these artists and with their works and with this concept of the crossroads, towards the end of it, we developed this statement that we're going to read with you and now. Prepare to arrive at the crossroads. Prepare to engage in question.
Prepare to affirm, celebrate, or react. Prepare to debate with the artists, the works, and with us, the curators.
Prepare to wander into wonder. Be prepared to reflect and to wrangle.
With the archives, the past, the present, humanity, struggle, disturbance, fallibility, distinction, beauty, faith, truth, prejudice, artistry, controversies, and consequences.
In this challenging moment, be prepared to stand at the crossroads of time, place, and perspective. So with that, we invite you into our exhibition, into all of these moments and ideas and emotions. I'm just pointing out and recalling that Benny Andrews, Alice Walker, and Flannery O'Connor lived along the 441 corridor that cuts through Georgia. And they're among multiple artists and writers. You see some of them in the background there, like Margaret Mitchell or Joel Chandler Harris or Herbert Reese. Some of you may have heard of him, Lillian Smith. And they came to our forefront in Georgia because of their close geographical connection with one another, and also because their lives and works converged in other ways. And finally, because all of their papers are held in the Rose Library. In the exhibition, we encounter them both as very young, idealistic, or playful, you might say, young people who from an early age had a sense of vocation. And we also come to understand them as adults and the people and the artists that they became. Very different from one another, yet some important connections. We do all this in the exhibition with, in the background, a section that we call Voices in Context of History and Place. As you all will recall, you Flannery O'Connor scholars, Flannery O'Connor wrote her short story, which is at the centerpiece, really, of the exhibition, Everything That Rises Must Converge. She wrote that story in the early 60s. And in the background was, of course, the civil rights movement. And events were happening all around her. They were happening in Milledgeville, they were happening in Albany, they were happening in Atlanta, and they were also happening at the University of Georgia at Athens. The time she's writing this short story is the time that the University of Georgia was integrated after a complicated courtroom struggle. And the integration was led by two young people, Charlene Hunter Galt, who later became an award-winning journalist, and Hamilton Holmes, who became a very distinguished cardiologist. And so this background is informing her. And even though O'Connor was known to have written and said to friends that she really didn't engage with the topical, that is what was going on at the time, what we found and what we felt, and I'm sure what you all have experienced, is that that's not completely the whole story. And in fact, in this particular story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, she does engage very deeply in the topical. And so, as we know, the story takes place on a bus. And O'Connor is sort of the great artist of things happening in tight spots. And the bus, a heavily featured element of the civil rights movement. And on it, of course, we have a white woman with her son and a Black woman and her son. And the common element that tries to connect them, but also drives them apart, is the fact that they're both wearing the same hat. And so a lot of different dynamics ensue from that encounter on the bus, and that has a dramatic effect on the story and in their lives. At this point in her life, Flannery O'Connor had been very involved and engaged in the works of Teilhard de Chardin. And she had written letters to her friends. She had had a visit from Robert Giroux, her publisher. She'd been involved in an ongoing conversation with Professor Ted Spivey at Georgia State University. And she begins to engage with Chardin, especially around the ideas of kind of evolutionary ideas, which he's studying and presenting in his work as a paleontologist at the same time as he is a Jesuit priest. And so these evolutionary ideas that people are moving towards an omega point is something that comes to inform her both with her illness, from which she is now becoming extremely frail, and facing her own mortality, and with the larger social disturbances that are happening around her, and trying to bring both of these things into some kind of perspective that's meaningful within her faith, and that also speaks to her vocation as a writer. So this quotation, which is of course quite famous now due to that story from Chardin: "Remain true to yourself, but move ever upward toward greater consciousness and greater love. At the summit, you will find yourselves united with all those who from every direction have made the same ascent. For everything that rises must converge." And of course, this title has a very profound effect on people who encounter it, not quite knowing what it fully means, where it fully comes from, and if in fact everything that rises must converge. But that is what Flannery O'Connor is drawing from in both her artistic and her spiritual life. And here we enter into the exhibition, where Amy will take us on a tour from here.
Rosemary, just keep your mic on for just a second. So we have been working on this exhibition for about 4 years, but it even predates that. It stretches back to a time where Rosemary was in conversation with Pelham McDaniels, the late Pelham McDaniels, precisely about Everything That Rises Must Converge. Rosemary, do you have any other background you want to share on that?
One of my favorite volumes in the Rose Library is this large elephant folio volume that is a beautiful, beautiful rare book. And I came across it a number of years ago. And of course, being from the Atlanta area and from originally from Savannah, I was familiar with the life and work of Benny Andrews. And so I found it most curious as to why Benny Andrews was illustrating a story by Flannery O'Connor.
And so, yeah, so then she got into conversation with Pella McDaniels, who was the curator of the African-American collections, I believe, at Emory before his untimely death. But they were in conversation about this exhibition, and eventually, and I'll mention later on how I got involved, et cetera, but eventually it grew into this much bigger enterprise. But what I wanted to point out was from the very beginning, everything that rises must converge was at the heart of this exhibit. And I think as Rosemary mentioned, there were many people involved, lots of, difficult conversations and winding roads to get here. But one of the things that stayed fairly stable was the idea that everything that rises must converge would be presented in this rotunda, in this circular place, in this meeting place, this place of reflection, where people could come and really contemplate Benny Andrews' illustrations and the artistic miracle that is the gathering of these three artists across time. So it wasn't at the same moment around this story. So Rosemary, just advance to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to just briefly talk about this convergence. So the earliest response to Everything Rises Must Converge was Alice Walker's. Probably many of you, I'm looking at the people here, I know most of you are very familiar with these works by Alice Walker, but just a quick review. In 1966, yes, Alice Walker was at the tail end of her college years. I'm actually not sure the year she graduated from Sarah Lawrence, maybe one of somebody here knows, but it was around that time. And she had been reading Flannery O'Connor in her early college years. And at some point she became aware that she wasn't reading Black writers, that they hadn't even been presented to her. And that made her angry, but never in some sense diminished what she calls the magic and mystery of O'Connor. Hold on. So sorry, we're about to have a dog experience here. But she never sort of lost the haunting of O'Connor in her literary imagination. So in 1966, she writes this fictional response, Convergence, that didn't come to publication until one of our co-curators, Dr. Nagyalti Warren, took it on as a archival project and brought it to publication. And then she responded again in 1975 in her essay Beyond the Peacock, in which she retells the story of Everything That Rises Must Converge and makes a call for what she calls the whole story. So she says, O'Connor's story was a good story, but it was not the whole story. And her fictional response, Convergence, in some sense, is trying to offer that whole story. Because what we don't get, and Alice Walker thinks this is to Flannery O'Connor's credit, we don't get the Black woman's story, right? We don't only see the effects of her rage, but we do not get her personal story. And that, in some sense, is what Alice Walker attempts to tell. All right, so let's move on to the next slide here. And we also feature a quilt in more than one place in the exhibition. And quilts, again, were a way Alice Walker tried to get at the idea of the whole story. Because in a quilt, you have these separate fragments that you stitch together. So that's sort of a metaphorical representation of the same literary aspiration. Okay, and now I want to talk a little bit, Rosemary, you can go to the Benny Andrews slides. So I want to talk a little bit more about this book that that Rosemary mentioned. So it's a stunning book. It's huge. When I first saw it, I had to stand on a stepladder with a camera to be able to photograph it in the Rose Library reading room. But the illustrations are stunning, and you'll see in a slide or two from here that Benny Andrews actually went through quite a process of sketches to work up these paintings. Here you go. So he was an illustrator of children's books. Of course, he was primarily a fine arts artist himself, not an illustrator, but he began later in his life illustrating children's books. But then, so he took on this project as a different kind of illustration. And art departments always ask you to work up sketches. That's exactly what he did. And actually, Rosemary and I recently learned in another presentation with our co-curators by Tina Dunkley, who curated the Benny Andrews section, we learned that it wasn't his choice, which ended up being the final one for the book. The art directors were choosing from the sketches that he developed. Okay, one more slide. And so Rosemary is going to talk a bit about the painting you see here, so I won't address that right now. But he wrote this stunning afterword about why he took this dare, as he put it, to illustrate this book. So what you see coming together in this rotunda is this meeting across time. So he's doing this in the 2000s. Alice Walker was doing this in 1966 and 1975. Flannery O'Connor was writing the original story back in 1961. And of course, all of this is revolving around a story that's actually taking place in the 1960s in Georgia. So we see these layers of people coming together and stories coming together in the rotunda. All three of these texts are, actually all four of these texts are present in this large screen on the hallway. And one of the things I think that's really nice is you can see Alice Walker's convergence with her notes. It's a typescript manuscript. All right, so let's go forward a little bit here. And I think we're going to switch over now to Rosemary to talk a bit about, I don't know, Rosemary, if you want to back up again, so you can start with that portrait. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, let's start with the portrait. So one of the, Benny Andrews first put together his thoughts regarding Flannery O'Connor when he was invited to the conference in Milledgeville, I think in 2000. And that is, in fact, one of the things that led to this large folio volume. And I guess while he was sort of dallying around in that and thinking about what his approach would be, he also created this portrait of O'Connor, which is, his work can be kind of very mosaic-like. And if you get up close and personal to it, and which you can do in the corridor of our exhibition there, you can see the granularity of it. And, he has Andalusia, of course, in the background. You have O'Connor there. You have the birds. You have the splendor of the peacock, the sense of the landscape. So it's a very, unusual, I would say, even for Benny Andrews, and kind of the beauty and the liveliness of this portrait. This does not appear in the book, but it is an important aspect of what his thought processes be, and does in fact appear in our exhibition. And so I think one of the things that really drew all of us to this work was a sense of reflection, of the sense of self-reflection these artists have. We see this with the afterword by Benny Andrews, the kind of self-reflection that we saw already with Alice Walker in what she had to write and say and process. And we also invite our viewers into a sense of self-reflection. And so we have in the exhibition a number of things that call upon that. In particular, I like to point to the correspondence, which is one of my favorite aspects of the materials in the Rose Library. And everything that is in the exhibition, with just a few very few exceptions, are drawn from the materials that are there. And here on the right-hand side, we'll go first, is, what we call the world's first selfie. This is Flannery O'Connor in Iowa, taking a picture of herself in front of a mirror. And of course, during that same period of time, she's writing tons and tons of letters, particularly to her mother, Regina. We have those letters, and there are several hundred of those letters on a daily basis where she's requesting mayonnaise, or a particular kind of hat pin, or, some other wonderful aspect of Georgia culture, which is not available in Iowa. In this letter writing tradition that she began with her mother in particular, and with others along the way, including other writers, stayed with her her whole life. I mean, she was really writing letters up until the end of her life. And of all of the letters that we have and all of the letters that I've read, and many of them that are included in The Habit of Being by Sally Fitzgerald, this is one of my favorites. And this is to Betty Hester, who was the postal clerk here in Atlanta, a somewhat lost soul who reaches out to O'Connor. And this is O'Connor's first letter to Betty Hester, known as A in The Habit of Being. And I'll just going to read you the very first paragraph of it. This is in July of 55. I'm very pleased to have your letter. Perhaps it is even more startling to me to find someone who recognizes my work for what I try to make it than it is for you to find a God-conscious writer near at hand. The distance is 87 miles, but I feel the spiritual distance is shorter. And that sense of spiritual distance that O'Connor established with other writers, other correspondents, and those of us today who have traveled that, literally that 441 corridor, or who have come to know her work in its many, many manifestations. I was so taken with it that I took that selfie on the right-hand side, and we have in the exhibition, to encourage this kind of state of self-reflection, we have a mirror, and I took my selfie, trying to mimic O'Connor. I guess I should have worn an outfit more like hers. But nonetheless, in the background, you see the way the exhibition is set up, thanks to our exhibition designer, we see the portrait that Benny Andrews had created of Flannery O'Connor. So in every regard, this exhibition is about that kind of creative and self-reflection. And earlier in her life, O'Connor had begun her creative explorations.
So in the corridor, again, we have the corridor, sort of the creative process behind the work. In particular for the O'Connor and Benny Andrews section, it's very much the creative process behind the story, everything that rises must converge. So one of the great joys for me, we promised in advertising this evening that we would talk about our passions, the things that drew us to working on this. And for me, it was her juvenilia. So I just kind of stumbled upon it because I was writing The Strange Birds of Flannery O'Connor and wanted to see what was present in the archives. And I remember the first time I went, I was just stunned at the sheer quantity of the material that's kept. And then also just on the rich reservoir of materials that really give deep insight into the work she would do for the rest of her life. And so I'll continue talking about that. But in particular, for everything that rises must converge. Actually, just back up one more. So the things that we focus on here are the inspiration for the characters. In particular, we all know that her mother, Regina, was an inspiration for many of her female characters, as were the other women in her extended family and the women in her orbit. But I love this. The whole story begins with the mother going to a reducing class and therefore having to take the bus. But here we see sketches from her juvenilia precisely of her mother engaged in reducing classes. Okay, the next slide is the inspiration for the son. Throughout her work, she presents characters who have been educated often in the North and have come back to judge their family. And interestingly, when Alice Walker wrote Convergence, that was exactly the parallel she laid out as well. The character, instead of Julian, there's a daughter named Adrian, and she has been educated. She comes home to school her mother. So here in her college cartoons, we see two examples of that. The one in black and white, the little caption at the bottom, you might not be able to read, says, she says we're on the threshold of social revolution. So the mother is sort of scoffing at her judgmental daughter. And similarly, in the next one, I think you can almost see that as Mary Grace sitting there. And so we get the sense that this character Julian is deep in her consciousness, and in some sense is her, or is an aspect of her. Okay, the next screen is the hat. So again, a delightful aspect of the juvenilia, and this is just a small subset of the gallery of hats I could exhibit for you. There are hats on birds, there are hats on farmers, there are big bows like hats on little girls that are surely her. There are hats on her parents, on her her father, her mother, her aunts, and these various characters she concocted as a child. But hats are everywhere. And the quotation that is beside it is one you may recognize about the wooden leg. And of course, I note that in the caption, but it's just as true and relevant in this case by replacing wooden leg with hat. If you want to say that a hat is a symbol, you can say that, but it is a hat first, and it is a hat, and as a hat it is absolutely necessary to the story. And so of course Everything That Rises Must Converge is her ultimate story about a hat.
Just a funny anecdote there while we're on the subject of hats. For those of us who had the privilege of getting to know Louise Florencourt quite well, she also wore a hat everywhere she went. And towards the end of her life, when I was visiting her, she asked me if there was something of hers that I'd like to have. And I told her, I'd like to have one of your hats, Louise. So that's a very prized possession for me and very connected to this O'Connor story and lineage.
You have a beautiful picture of you and Louise with your hats. We should have put it in here. Thought about it. Okay, let's see what the next slide is. So, oh yes, and this is the final little slide on the hats. And again, these are just sketches for cartoons she did in college. One thing I love about both of these, though, is you see the hat visually playing a symbolic role, making a comment on the character who wears it. In particular, the one where you see the hat pin has also become a skewer. And in the case in the hallway there, we not only have the original of one of these cartoons, but we have the hat pins, some hat pins that were O'Connor's. So you can advance it one more. Okay, and let me talk a little bit about this. We may come back around a little bit more. So this is actually not in the corridor, but it very much lays the foundation for Everything That Rises Must Converge. So what we tried to do here is take the viewer through a story of O'Connor's relationship to race through her juvenilia. So you begin, and it's maybe a little hard to see here, but you see she's kind of mapping her world on that first sketch. And in the middle of that, there is a character that looks like a Pickaninny doll with the title Black above it. And then you see her actually holding a Pickaninny doll, which was a racist form of doll that many Southern white girls were given, and she was no exception. You also see her participating in various events that would be standard for a white Southern family at the time, and riding a horse. And there's a Black farmhand leading her horse around. And there's actually a little film called Lawn Party, where she's a teenager, probably about the same age. For all I know, it was the same day, where you see a lot of the younger members of the family on horseback being led around by a Black farmhand. Then we also go through these sequence of letters. So these very racist letters she sent home when she was 17. And then only a couple years later, when she is at Iowa, writing letters that show that she is really revisiting that person she was, who was writing to her mother and sort of regurgitating these racist views from her childhood, now rethinking that. And then one of the most satisfying and revelatory aspects of the archives for me was coming across two unpublished stories from Iowa. One is White Girl, and the other one is Frizzly Chicken. We have them on an iPad. You can read them in full, but they're both her attempt to understand how a child, and they're very thinly veiled autobiography, even though she's sort of presenting them as fiction, how a child learns to be racist, how a child learns that process of othering, which of course becomes prejudice more largely construed, but in particular, as a case in point in racism, becomes one of the major themes of her fiction. As Rosemary mentioned earlier, she says herself that she has only delved into the topical once. But when you read her fiction as a whole, you see again and again that anti-Black racism in particular is a very common theme. But for her, of course, that was a case in point of sin. It wasn't, in some sense, something special. It was something to be expected and something to be delved into like we would into any sort of human blindness. So let's look at what's coming next. All right, so let me just give you a quick introduction to this, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Rosemary. So in the story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, there are two questions. At one point, the mother says to her son, Julian, well, I know who I am. And he says back to her, like shoots back at her, knowing who you are is good for one generation only. To know who you are, you must know where you are. And so those become the guiding questions of our exhibition. Who am I? Where am I? And then we added a third, which we thought was implicit in the story, but was really necessary in getting at the life work of these three artists. So the third question is, what am I seeking? And you can kind of see this, I don't know if Rosemary, you captured this, somebody captured this, but on the screen at the back of the Shatton Gallery, these questions cycle along with other images. Where am I? Who am I? Where am I? What am I seeking? And so they sort of provide this overarching question for the viewer, and the questions that guide our exhibition, and in some sense, the question at the heart of the lives of these figures. And with that, let me turn it over to Rosemary. Rosemary, you might want to just mention really quick something about the Middle Georgia-ness of this, of the Shatton Gallery, because I know that you were I think you were the person who really originated that idea.
Yeah, what we wanted, you can see it in part here. It's a big block of area, swath of area, and we wanted it to kind of mimic the terrain, if you will, or at least the directionality. So on the back left-hand side, you would see, if you were there, a panel of Benny Andrews standing in front of a home near Madison, Georgia, where he grew up. On the right-hand side, you'd see a portrait of Alice Walker, a photographic portrait of her. And on the right-hand side, which you can't see in this photo, but I think you'll see later, is Flannery O'Connor. So those are three of the four quadrants, mapping them out geographically with these signs. If you want to go this way, you're going to be seeing Benny Andrews, that way for Flannery O'Connor, another way for Alice Walker, and then the fourth quadrant I already mentioned is the one about the voices in the context of history and place. So this, we were recreating that in effect at this crossroads.
Let me add just one extra thing. Our designer, John Klinger, did a beautiful job. He took all these photographs of trees on his many walks. And I think one of the most moving aspects of the exhibit, at least for me, but I've heard this from other people who've seen it, is that when you come into the Shatton Gallery, this is, you're seeing this, but then all around you are these floor to ceiling towering Georgia trees. And you get that sense of coming into Middle Georgia.
So that terrain being very important to their lives and their work. And, just for those of you who may not know as much about Benny Andrews as you'd like, there's ample opportunity to visit the exhibition and learn more about him. He grew up a sharecropper's family, very creative, interesting family. His brother was also a novelist, Raymond Andrews. And we see him here on the left in his studio, a portrait of him. On the right, I hope you can see it because it's a self-portrait of him doing art. And then in the middle, he was very engaged in seeking inclusion of women, Blacks, everyone in the world of art in New York, at the High Museum of Art, where have you. So he was an activist as well as an artist, and a very important part of his life. And in fact, he became the director for the National Endowment for the Humanities. He received numerous honorary degrees. He, as this story alludes to, had a genius for caring. Involvement was essential to him. And also he received an honorary degree from Emory in the early 2000s as well. So he's a very important artist from Georgia, and his work is displayed all over the world and certainly essential to this exhibition. And as well, you know, we have the papers and the work of Alice Walker, and each of these sections were co-curated by different individuals or groups, and our fellow curators, Nagi T. Warren and Gabrielle Dudley, you know, wanted to point out the spiritual aspects of Alice Walker and her work. And there are many elements of that. There are also, of course, she's known as an activist, and sometimes her activism as well as her work has created controversy. Some of those early controversies were around The Color Purple, the novel, but especially the movie The Color Purple, and their representation of Black men in particular. But here we have on display in the exhibition the original manuscript, the handwritten manuscript of The Color Purple in the spiral-bound notebook. And so people are just in awe of seeing her handwriting, her erasures, her corrections, and coming to think of her work as shifting and developing over time. And, you know, and for O'Connor, we come to know her through some of the things that we've already talked about. And you can take it from here, Amy.
Okay. Something I just wanted to add about, well, I'll come back to that. Yeah, so one of the things that has come out of this collaboration, and I think is just sort of serendipitous. We knew that there were going to be all of these moments of convergence that just happened as we were going through the lives of these figures. But I think one of the most striking to me was when we all started talking about our curation, both together and then to other people, that each of us had something that was really important to us as a curator that occurred in the 15th year of our, or I guess I should say the 16th year, when they were 15 years old. So in that age 15 year of these three artists. So if you've ever heard me speak before, you will be familiar with what I'm about to speak on with respect to O'Connor. So why don't you go to the next slide here? So in the year 1941, she wrote this story, Mistaken Identity. And again, I think in this crowd, everybody's fairly familiar with that story. But that, as I did a lot of research around that year, I looked at everything I could find in the archives around 1941. I really realized what a watershed year that was for O'Connor, because it was not only the year she turned 16, it was the year her father died, it was the year Pearl Harbor was bombed. So the whole world, both internal to her, in her immediate family, and in the world at large, was cataclysmically changing in some way. And it was this year that she really, as she said in her own words, tried to bring literature into being, tried to physically bring it into being by, hand punching all these holes, hand winding this wire, etc. And then in college, just one more slide. In college, she reflected back on that year, which is really, I think, the thing that gives us the insight of how important that year was for her. So I just want to read the very beginning of this. She says, "The reality of death has come suddenly upon us, and the power of God has broken our complacency like a sharp arrow in the side." And she crosses it out, looking for something, some sense even more violent, like a bullet in the side. A sense of the dramatic, of the infinite, of the tragic has descended upon us, filling us with grief, but even above grief, wonder. She is outlining a revelation, a transformation, and the nature of that transformation is violent, and it includes both grief and wonder. And I think that if we look at her fiction, that is a beautiful characterization of virtually every single moment of revelation in her stories. So for me, this year really laid the groundwork and for the rest of her fiction. So very interesting to me was hearing both Tina Dunkley and Gabrielle Dudley talk about a similar moment, maybe not quite as watershed, but a moment of self-knowledge, a moment of coming into one's own. So if you go to the next screen, Rosemary. So Benny Andrews, when he was 15, wrote an article, and Tina Dunkley, again, who was the artist who curated the Benny Andrews section, she's an artist herself and a museum curator, said that this was maybe her favorite piece in the archives. She found it so striking, the level of self-awareness he had as a 15-year-old young man growing up in Georgia. And I'll just read you a little bit, the very first paragraph, which this is just a transcription of what you see in the his school newspaper. He writes, "The Negroes have come a long way. They first started in slavery. They were slaves who worked from sun to sun, slept in cabins while their masters lived off the work they did. When they did not work to suit them, they would whip them unmercifully." And he goes on, though, with actually a very much of a hopeful take, a sort of call to action. You see the seeds of his activism, and he does all of this research on the numbers of Black people that were doing this type of work and this type of work, and really trying to give a sense that it was time, it was his time, that he was going to move into this life. And as a sharecropper's son, in this world of Georgia, it's just striking to see a young man with such a sense of clarity and purpose. And then on the next slide, Alice Walker put together this beautiful scrapbook when she was 15 years old. And Gabrielle Dudley cites this as her favorite thing in the archives. And if you just click forward, Rosemary, it's going to bring up. So this is what she actually writes on the type in, she's typed this out herself on the page behind this. She says, "So I dedicate the collection of these works," and she says, "first and foremost, to myself." And I love to hear Gabrielle talk about this, because she just finds this so beautiful that she would have thought at 15 years old to dedicate this to herself, not first and foremost to her parents or her teachers or all of these other people, but to herself. And then if you click one more time, and then she says, "This book contains the poems of a child poetess." And so for all three of them, you get this stunning sense of vocation from such a young age. And it's one of the things, again, that I am personally motivated by. I think almost everything I write has somewhere in it the quest to locate the seeds of the adult person in the child. And I feel like invariably, always, without fail, I find that. And I found it so beautifully and powerfully through the work for this exhibition.
Actually, my dog was so struck by it, you might have heard her shaking herself in the background.
All right.
And one of the things, as we close here, we have a few concluding slides. There's obviously more in the exhibition than we can talk about, but we began to see the special collections and the archives themselves, whether there are archives or any archives, as a crossroads themselves, where different types of writers, different types of thinkers, different types of artists come together. And we have papers of Confederate soldiers. We also have papers of the Ku Klux Klan. We also have papers of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and civil rights activists. And so those materials come together in very unexpected and sometimes, as in this case, very serendipitous ways for us. So, these materials are so important to our collection, the Alice Walker, Flannery O'Connor, Benny Andrews. Now that we've talked about them all together, it seems, very obvious that they would have come together, but we're pleased that we could kind of reunite their worldviews, even as varied as they were, in conversation with one another. And they're part of a larger archive that includes U.S. Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey, some Ralph McGill and Jack Nelson, civil rights journalist Salman Rushdie, who took a road trip to Milledgeville with me and a colleague to Milledgeville and then to Eatonton, Georgia. You see him there with Brer Rabbit. And, you know, anybody who can guess who that photo is in the top corner, Craig will give that person $2, which won't even buy you a cup of coffee. So we'll save that for the Q&A. And then there's our curatorial team. From the left, moving left, Tina Dunkley, who curated the Benny Andrews part, Nagi Alty Warren, a retired professor from Emory, myself and Amy, Gabrielle Dudley, who is currently acting director of the Rose Library and worked on the Alice Walker section, and the then director, Jennifer Gunter King, who tried to rein us in and was somewhat successful most of the time. And our designers, these are the two people who are responsible for, you know, putting into imagery and space all of our free-flowing ideas. And it was a pleasure to work with them, and I'm sure they found us extremely challenging. But we're all pleased with the outcome, and here are Amy and I celebrating at the opening of the exhibition. And there you see the panel for Flannery O'Connor, the curved wall, behind which is many of the materials we've talked about this evening. So it was a huge celebratory moment, and we're happy to share this exhibition and this experience with you.
I don't know how many of you have actually seen the exhibition. One of the things Rosemary spoke earlier about, that sense of reflection, one of the things we really loved about the way the Schatten Gallery came together is that you have these curved panels, 3 of which represent the artists, and then the 4th is the voices in the context of history and geography. And so you have all of these panels kind of looking at each other. And again, once again, you have that sense of reflection and meeting at a crossroads. But yes, it was a great joy. It was a great joy to work with Rosemary. One of the things I've enjoyed most in my professional career, and hopefully there's a few projects still sort of coming forth out of this. And it was just a great joy working with the other curators as well. So thanks for coming this evening. Yes.
We invite you all to come. The exhibition is up until the middle of July, and it's pretty much open all the time. The only time it will not be open is when at the last week of the semester during finals, the library is only open to students. But I'm happy to share more information about that if you're interested.
There's a few things forthcoming, and I know Craig wants to say some words on that, but just we have some curator panels that are happening, which would be a really nice time to visit. And I don't know, Rosemary, if you have access to those dates. I know one of them is May 8th. There's one in April that I'm not going to be able to attend, but I will be there for the May one. But then Rosemary and I have also been working with the team behind Wildcat, Ethan Hawke and his daughter Maya Hawke. So we are going to, it's going to be opening in Atlanta at I think 2 different theaters, but we're also going to have a screening on campus on May 10th. And Rosemary and I are going to conduct what's called a creativity conversation, something I believe Rosemary started at Emory and she's I think you had a creativity conversation with Alice Walker, didn't you?
I was part of one. Yes, I was.
So it's sort of a long-standing series at Emory, but Rosemary and I are going to have a creativity conversation with Ethan Hawke and possibly Maya Hawke, who will be shooting Stranger Things while this is happening. So depends on her schedule and energy levels whether or not she's going to show up. But we will definitely be having a conversation with Ethan Hawke, both about the exhibition and about Wildcat and about creativity in general.
So is there a way to get the specific details about those panels and your event with Ethan Hawke?
Yes, we can. We don't think we have anything that's published yet for the Wildcat screening that's forthcoming soon, but we can definitely send you a link that you can pass out to this crowd. That I mean, I actually might be able to find it while somebody else talks. I'll see if I can.
Yeah, we are interested in your, I know we took up all, if not most, if not all the time, but we're eager to hear from you all and get your thoughts, reactions, questions.
So I've had the pleasure of going to the exhibit twice. The first time I was focused very much on Flannery O'Connor. We went there, my wife Pat is on the Zoom as well. We went there with one of the other participants, and Ann Ritter and her husband and some friends. We spent, I think, 2.5 hours there. And then I had a chance to go back and spend more time specifically on the Alice Walker and Benny Andrews, who I knew much less about. It's an amazing experience, and I would encourage everyone who hasn't been there to try to get there. So has it been extended? I thought originally it was going to end in May. It sounds like
That's
it's
correct. It's been extended for a couple of months.
awesome. Awesome. So can you talk a little bit more about kind of the genesis and the vision of the exhibit in, you know, in all its dimensions?
It was gradual. It was incremental. I mean, obviously, my former colleague and I talked about the Benny Andrews and the Alice Walker part for a while. A professor of history at Emory was involved in some conversations about that. Things were developing, and then we lost at the beginning of COVID. We lost my friend and colleague Pella McDaniels, who died suddenly about 4 years ago. And, you know, that put a little bit of a, you know, adjustment. And of course, all of us were going through a lot at that moment. But, you know, and then due to the Alice Walker materials being in the Rose Library and the story Convergence having been found there in the archives by one of our fellow curators, there began to be an interest in Alice Walker being included. So that was evolving. And at the same time, you know, Amy had been using the archives and she was thinking about some exhibitions herself.
Yes, I was had actually proposed an exhibition on O'Connor's juvenilia, and that was kind of moving forward. But then, or there was a little bit of momentum behind it. They were excited about the idea, but then there's this other exhibition that was kind of in the works, and they said, you know, for a long time we've really been wanting to do this kind of all-out O'Connor exhibition, and now so we're having these different things. Why don't we bring them together? So I got involved at that early stage when Pelham was still with us. And then I think it took a little while to regroup after that. And as we regrouped, that's when it became an even bigger enterprise, bringing Alice Walker in as well. So, you know, we really had regular meetings for 3 years with this team of 6 curators. So it was quite it was quite an undertaking.
It was very overwhelming.
It was. If you saw all of the spreadsheets and PowerPoints and maps that were hand-drawn maps, etc. Yeah, I don't know if any of us would have taken it on if we'd known what it was going to be like, but now that it's happened, I'm extremely happy that I did take it on. So
I tried to put in the chat a link to that document. See if you can open that. The document that has the events listed. Yeah, you should be able to do so. Oopsie.
Yeah, I've got it saved off. I'll try to look at it later, Rosemary.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Other questions from the participants?
No questions, but I was just gonna say thank you both. This is great. Enjoyed it. Enjoyed the pictures especially, and having it's been a few months since I saw Wildcat, but you know, I definitely was thinking about you know, the kind of the bus scene in the movie, and then thinking about sort of what you all have done here. So yeah, it's exciting.
I'd like to add my thanks to Amy and Rosemary and the rest of your group. What a remarkable undertaking you undertook, and thanks so much for that. Just a word of thanks.
I'll second that. That was wonderful. Thank you.
And then if I could ask Tammy to put up, I have just a few more slides to bore you with here before we finish tonight. So
Craig, it's me sharing them.
okay, sorry, Jordan. Yeah, I think advance it 2 slides, Jordan. So since I attended the Institute, I developed what I call this Flannery O'Connor Renaissance slide. There's just so much going on in Flannery world, and I won't bore you by taking you through this, but the exhibit itself, which Rosemary and Amy did just a wonderful job of introducing us to, the movie Wildcat. Here in Milwaukee, our screening date is May 18th and 19th. You know, continued focus by Bishop Barron's organization, a couple books that were published, Father Damian Ference, Jessica Hooten Wilson, the Columbari tour, fall tour, Everything That Rises Must Converge. I'll talk just a little bit more in a second. There's a couple of academic events teed up, one in May in Chicago, the ALA conference, another one, the Study of Southern Literature conference in Biloxi. Both of those events have very prominent roles played by some of the NEH participants. The O'Connor conference in Milledgeville, I think papers are being, the deadline for submitting for that may be May 8th. Flannery O'Connor's Second Century, Looking Forward, Looking Back, and then look for additional Flannery O'Connor symposiums events as we move now toward the 100th anniversary of her birth.
And one thing I'll say about the O'Connor Conference in Milledgeville in September, since we have it funded through NEH, there is no registration fee. So, you know, if you do decide to attend, you know, there's not a fee for that.
Thank you, Jordan. Next slide. So I wanted to make sure for those of you who are not aware of the New York City-based theater troupe Compagnia dei Columbari, there's a number of us, couple of gentlemen on the Zoom tonight, Bill Monroe from Houston and Farrell O'Gorman, who's there at Belmont Abbey, and along with Father Damian Ference in Cleveland, are working closely with Karen Coonrod, the founder of Columbari, and her business manager to execute on a tour in the fall. So next slide, Jordan. So this is just a snapshot from their marketing material, but I'm encouraging Karen and company to give the tour a name. I joke, the Resurrection Tour, the Renaissance Tour, but it looks like these 4 cities, Milwaukee, Houston, Cleveland, and Charlotte, in that order, trying to concentrate those performances during the course of the month. Dates are still a little bit fluid, but you know, keep your eye open for you know, as those dates firm up and alerts on that. It's kind of a 3-pronged set of events. The live performance of Everything That Rises Must Converge. Karen has agreed to do workshops in each of the cities for you know, theater students and their instructors, and literature students and their instructors, and then the contextual conversation which follows the performance. So look, you know, stay tuned on that, on those events. Next slide, Jordan. And so again, if there are people that are interested in our upcoming series in Milwaukee, I wanted to highlight that Rosemary will be joining us over Zoom on the 22nd of April. If you are interested in an invitation, send me an email, craigfmartell@gmail.com, and I will forward to you the Osher Zoom invitation for the series. We've got 5 speakers teed up. John Hayes, who was recommended to us by Ralph C. Wood, Carol Schloss, who was one of our guest speakers at the NEH Institute, Daniel Moran, who published a book called Creating Flannery O'Connor, kind of a reception history of how Flannery has been unveiled since her death. And then Ben Alexander, whose book Good Things Out of Nazareth contains a number of letters that were not published in the habit of being. So let me know if you're interested in participating in that. You may or may not be aware of the recording through the Flannery O'Connor Institute for the Humanities of all the public lectures that were given during the Institute, pointing to those. And then also, next slide, Jordan. Number of upcoming events, again, hosted by this same platform. April 18th, 3 scholars from the Institute, Bill Gaunch, Matt Bryant Cheney, and Will Murray, more discussion on O'Connor and race, and Ashley Massey and Tim Vanderbrake, discussion on O'Connor and Andalusia. And there's a Writing for Success Symposium in June. And so those are the, if you will, the prepared slides. I can't thank Amy and Rosemary enough for their presentation and discussion. I absolutely love the curator statement that you started with, and you know, you're sharing what you have on Flannery, Benny Andrews, and Alice Walker. It's just incredible. Other comments as we anticipate signing off? Dorian. Yes, my dear. Good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you too, Craig. Thank you so much for the exhibit. I was able to visit it in January and just spent, a couple of hours there. Really enjoyed it. I'm curious as to the responses you've gotten from people. I personally came originally. I knew about it through the NEH O'Connor program, and I was familiar with that. Alice Walker, had read her work. I didn't know very much about Benny Andrews, and I wonder if that's kind of typical of people who have visited the exhibit, or if you've had any responses. I think this is a great way to kind of lift the profiles of all three of the individuals and celebrating them together.
So it varies. There are people who are drawn to each section, like specifically coming for a particular artist that they already know about or want to know more about, and may be familiar with the other two. But I would say probably in terms of kind of celebrity status, the least is known about Benny Andrews, who has some of the most phenomenal work. He is pretty well known in and around the Atlanta arts communities because he played very instrumental roles here. And also his father was something of an artist. His mother was quite a phenomenon. And his brother, Raymond Andrews, was an important Georgia author. And Benny illustrated all of Raymond's novels. So he does have a following, but we are really delighted to expand that following.
Yes, I think also it kind of comes down to how well known fine artists are. It's kind of like poets who might be like the most famous poet in the world, but most people don't know their name. And I think Benny Andrews, his art hangs in the MoMA in New York City. Like, he is an incredibly celebrated artist, but I agree, a lot of people don't know him. So I do think it's just an amazing opportunity for people to see his work. One thing that really struck me, I had the chance to walk through the exhibit at the opening. There was so much going on. I didn't get as much time to spend in the exhibit itself, but I was just there for a curator talk, and I spent hours in the exhibition, and I was really taken with the Benny Andrews section. And there's one part that I just love. Tina Dunkley is an artist herself, and I love seeing people's obsessions come out in their curation. And one of the things she was really fascinated by were these contour drawings that Benny Andrews did. And so she was trying to understand how that related to the rest of his art. And there was this particular sketchbook. And so she lets us go through that sketchbook in this on this digital screen, and it's quite powerful. So yeah, if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, I think there's just so many little moments, like treasure moments, that can be really inspiring, and were very inspiring for me as like a working writer. I came away from that exhibition with even though I was part of it, really feeling inspired and changed. So,
Teresa, you had a question, right?
No question. I was a docent at the Morris Museum of Art in Augusta, and Benny Andrews is featured there along with his father, who drew a family tree, and it's a tree with the family members on it. From my understanding, with only 100 hours of docenting in 1 year at the museum, he's often referred to as a regional artist, but again, if you look at him, I think he's so much more than that, and he's definitely worthy of exploring. The picture that's in the Morris Museum of Art is collage, and he drew the picture in the Morris Museum of Art the same way. It's a preacher, and it's evangelical. So the preacher is tall and thin with those thin feet, the thin, long feet, and the elongated body. And he used fabric for the clothing. And because of the age of the artwork, the fabric is lifting up off the canvas, but it's still really, it's an amazing piece of art. And if you find yourself in the Augusta area for the Masters or some other thing like that, it's a worthy museum to explore because it features Southern artists. And
thank you for mentioning that, Teresa. And also the Madison Morgan Cultural Center that's there in Madison, Georgia, is featuring the lives and works of the Andrews family, all of them phenomenal people. And so it's definitely worth a trip in or out of Milledgeville or on the way to Athens or to Atlanta. It's quite a phenomenal exhibition itself. And I agree with you, his work is far more important. I mean, it is of the region and of the place. There's no question about it. Just as Flannery O'Connor's work is of the region and of the place, but its meaning and its importance expands well beyond that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the collage. If you look closely at the portrait he did, Flannery O'Connor, that began his migrant series, it is actually also collaged partially.
Okay, I think we're coming up on penalty time. So again, Amy and Rosemary, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Portrait was in the presentation, that dreamy looking man that was with the other artists there. I didn't receive any guesses on that. So Craig, you're not out $2 yet. It's if you can recall what that picture looked like, very dreamy man looking off into the sunset. It is actually, believe it or not, Jack Kerouac.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
From an earlier moment in his life before he went on the road. Or from a later moment in his life. I'm not exactly sure how old he was in that, but it was a different moment than on the road.
Yeah. That's great.
Good evening. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thanks, Jordan and Tammy, for hosting us.
Thank you.